Welcome to the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson, and this podcast series is a conversation with Matt, the Bearded Naked Yogi. In this 10-episode series, we're delving deep into the core principles of yoga, shedding light on its ancient wisdom and timeless teachings. Matt is taking us through the 8 limbs of yoga, sharing his philosophy and revealing the essence of this ancient practice. Matt, this is episode 7 of the series. What are we covering this time around?
So here we are, episode 7 of the 8 limbs of yoga. And in this episode, we will be discussing and examining the 6th limb, Dharana. Now, as with the previous limb in episode 6, Pratyahara, the practices of yoga here move away from the external and become deeply internal. The focus of the aspiring yogi becomes ever more self-reflective, not so much concerned with learning anything per se, but much more concerned with an examination and a removal from the consciousness of misconceptions, false perceptions that we hold about who we are and the abilities that we naturally possess.
So not learning, but almost forgetting. That sounds good to me. Let's dive into it. How do we engage with the limb of Dharana?
There's a wonderful saying within Buddhism that every day the student of Buddhism does not learn. They learn to forget or drop something. And we can apply that very, very equally to yoga. Now, engagement with the 6th limb of yoga, of Dharana. Dharana is a Sanskrit word that in Western tongues means concentration or a collection of the mind. And again, as we said in the previous episode, without going into too much detail, we understand by mind to be this conscious temporal awareness that we have. Now, the literal translation from Sanskrit of dharana is very interesting here. It literally translates as holding steady or a single focus. Dharana as a practice builds upon and deepens the techniques of pratyahara by refining that withdrawal of the senses, the withdrawal of external stimuli to the senses even further. It refines it down towards a single pointed concentration of the mind, a real focus of the mind. It is a practice of training the yogi's mind in a particular direction without allowing that focus and concentration to be broken.
That all makes sense, but what's the point of Dharana? What are we doing with all that focus and concentration?
So the purpose of Dharana is to bring the full, unwavering force of our awareness, attentiveness and consciousness to a single point in order to be able to cultivate, practice and maintain that state of deep concentration until it becomes absolutely unbreakable. Now, this training of the mind to concentrate is one of the real foundations of traditional yogic meditation, and we'll be discussing that more within the next episode of this podcast. Now, it can sound quite daunting. As we discussed briefly in the previous episode, mind loves its entertainment. Mind loves its little adventures. Let's use that crumpet analogy once again. You're sitting there and you're going, right, I'm going to cultivate my mind to focus deeply here. And then all of a sudden you're thinking about your shopping list. And before you know it, your mind has wandered off on its own little journey like Alice down the rabbit hole. You've completely forgotten why you're sitting down on your yoga mat in the first place. And then the mind is like, oh, well, I can't control myself. So you get up, you walk away and you do the hoovering. There's no concentration there and there's no focus there. There's also no awareness there. When one comes to the practices of Dharana, One needs to perhaps have a certain level of self-awareness and a certain level of awareness of the behavior of their mind. And again, this is where each of these limbs build upon each other. Cultivation of discipline, cultivation of awareness. At this point, we're getting into finer and finer methods of this. When you come to your mat to practice Dharana, concentrate, focus. If you are aware of the mind losing its concentration and focus, deep breath in, deep breath out, and you start again.
Okay, the breathing makes sense, but what are some practical ways in which we can sort of start to do that training of the mind and building that focus and concentration that are an essential part of this limb of yoga?
There are some very simple techniques that we can think about here. And let's just take a little step back and just re-emphasize that point of the mind and why these techniques are important. Is the mind is continually fluctuating in its attention. It moves rapidly from one thought to the next thought. You're always examining, questioning, analyzing, and making judgments. Whether you are consciously aware of that or not can be seen to be the point of doing yoga, practicing yoga in the first place. Your mind is constantly reacting to external and internal stimuli, those thoughts, those feelings. Naturally, there will be thoughts and impressions that arise within this practice of Dharana. And as I said, awareness here is key. This isn't about making a judgment towards yourself, first of all, about these practices, going, oh, my mind is too busy, I cannot do this, there's no point in doing this whatsoever. The mind is the mind. The mind has its own nature, and it allows us to live and exist within the world. But the yogi understands that on this journey, bringing their attentiveness back towards that single point of concentration relaxes the mind. Practice makes perfect. Discipline, once again, is its own reward. Now, there are some very simple techniques, and I say simple once again in inverted commas, techniques that we can use to concentrate the mind, to cultivate that sense of focus and discipline within our awareness. And some of these techniques, very simple, the use of mantra, chanting mantra within one's practice. You become concentrated, you become focused on the vibrations of sound that you are making with your vocal cords. You can even chant silently within inside your mind, but there establishes a relationship between your focus and the point of your focus, and it all dissolves down to that relationship, the observer and what is observed. It's all about awareness. Another wonderful technique is candle gazing. And one of the charming, if anyone's ever been to India, you may have seen these. You can buy some very charming little brass candle bowls that you buy a wick. And if you fill these little bowls with castor oil and light the flame, castor oil produces a very steady flame. It's not one that flickers all over the place. So it does provide something nice for your mind to focus on. And you place this candle at the level of your eyes. You sit there. You are the observer. Your conscious awareness is the observer. And there is the candle flame on what you gaze. You examine that relationship. That is Dharana, the focusing and training of the mind down onto that single point of concentration.
This is probably a stupid question, but I feel like this is a safe space in which I can ask it. But
love a safe space. All about the safe space.
I'm being vulnerable, but perhaps brave as well. Is Dharana the same thing as mindfulness?
Dharana can be seen as the yogic form of mindfulness. And the Buddhists, particularly the Zen Buddhists, the focus of their entire meditative practice is around mindfulness. And engaging with true mindfulness is seen as certainly one of the heights of the internal practice. And like I said, Dharana can be seen to be the yogic equivalent to these practices of mindfulness. And mindfulness is an interesting one. Certainly my understanding and application of it is it's simply to be mindful of what you were doing from one moment to the next in order to increase a sense of self-awareness in what one is doing. And it certainly helps to cultivate a calm and peaceful state. I think the key difference with Dharana to some of those more modern practices of mindfulness is that Dharana takes this mindfulness to another level, if you like, by just giving the mind one single thing to be full of. Whether or not that is complete and total concentration on one breath to the next breath, whether it is a complete absorption of concentration upon a single burning candle flame or upon a mantra that one finds particularly pleasing and easy to practice with. There is just the concentration of the yogi and the object on which they are concentrating. And within that concentration, within that mindfulness of the mind becomes calm all by itself.
We've been talking about how these different limbs of yoga are interconnected and sort of build on each other as they progress through. If we look at Dharana, do we have to have mastered the previous limbs, like specifically Dharana, before we can sort of tackle this part of the journey?
I think there are significant benefits if one takes a relaxed, linear approach to the limbs of yoga, and perhaps more so towards the final 4 limbs of yoga. That linear approach would certainly help in that cultivation of ever more refined states of awareness, self-understanding, and attentiveness as to what is actually happening. Not what the mind tells us is happening, but the truth of the situation. Now, that's not to say that sometimes we might not have a spontaneous experience of pratyahara or dharana or any of the other 8 limbs of yoga. And this certainly does happen if you've ever been engaged in a piece of work, perhaps, and you become so focused and absorbed within that piece of work that the rest of the world just drops away. And that can be considered to be a practice of dharana. Perhaps you find yourself daydreaming, lying. I'm a big one for an afternoon nap, so I might use that as an example here. Simply lying on the back of the body, enjoying oneself. You close your eyes. Maybe you have a spontaneous experience of practicing pratyahara. And that's fine. But it all comes down, once again, to the awareness of what one is doing. These spontaneous experiences, they don't tend to have a lasting impression or have an impact upon a yogi's journey through the 8 limbs, through the journey of yoga itself, simply because we are not aware of what is actually happening. Unless one has an understanding of pranayama, the stimulation of the body through the breath and the prana and the control of those 2 aspects of ourselves, one would not necessarily have as full an understanding of the practice of pratyahara. When one understands one thing through the cultivation of it, you can then also understand its opposite through a sense of withdrawal, a sense of removal from those things. And we can apply that to these higher aspects of the 8 limbs, if you like, certainly the final 3, which we've just begun here. It's all about that finer and finer sense of awareness. And maybe there is something to say here. Let's not try to run before we can walk. Self-understanding and the journey of yoga itself is that. It is a journey. The good shit happens when one metaphorical foot is put in front of the other with attentiveness and with mindfulness. Don't be in a rush to reach the end. Enjoy your practice and enjoy your journey.
That brings us to the end of episode 7 of the Bearded Naked podcast, unveiling the 8 limbs of yoga. I'm Gareth Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at GTV London. If you want to get in touch with Matt or find out more about his online courses and retreats, head over to his website, thebeardednakedyogi.com.
Thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you to everyone for listening, and we look forward to you joining us for the next episode. In episode 8 of this series, we are going to be exploring Dharana, a path of meditation. Namaste, and please look after yourselves.